many occasions after I retired from the military. I was in Alexandria House, which was a large condominium, and as a matter of fact, the tallest building probably in the whole Northern Virginia area, more than 24 stories, just a little over 24 stories. The rooftop happened to be a spot from which you could get a view, a very good view, of the whole Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, including the White House and the Capitol building, and not so much the Pentagon, oddly enough, just because of the configuration on the roof. But we were closer to the Pentagon than to any of those other buildings, just a few blocks.
Mm-hmm. Free, how did you find out about the September 11th attacks?
I found out initially, oddly enough, shortly after 8:30 in the morning that morning. I was calling Morgan Stanley, the bank, Morgan Stanley, in New York City on a business matter, and the person to whom I was talking was the head person in the head trading room at Morgan Stanley. And interestingly enough, we had not been talking more than a minute or two when he said, "I have to go." And I could tell that there was an alarm. And he, at the time, was in Midtown Manhattan, but most of Morgan Stanley is in the Wall Street area. And they obviously had been put on alert. Shortly after we initiated that conversation, the first aircraft hit down in the Wall Street area. I learned about that because I turned on the television right away to see, and the first announcement of that had happened. And I thought, my goodness, I was down on the 5th floor where my condominium was, so I immediately went to the rooftop to see if I could see anything, any activity, because the suspicion was that other aircraft might be hitting and might have been heading toward Washington, D.C. And so I took my position there, and I started to call the Air Force General Officer Protocol Office to see if they had any word. And the person there who was on the 4th floor in the Pentagon, shortly, interestingly enough, after we started a conversation, she said, "The full alarm's on, I have to go." So they were making all of the people in the Pentagon get as close to the inner part outside the 5th ring. And the 5th ring is elsewhere it would hit. So they would get everybody as far in as they could. Well, at that point, you knew something, and it hit the Pentagon within a minute or two again after I called. So that airplane had to have been somewhere close in the area when I got up to the top of the building. But in retrospect, I think that aircraft that finally hit the Pentagon was flying so close to a traffic pattern that is constantly flown by commercial aircraft coming up from the south to the north up the river before it did a 270-degree turn to hit the Pentagon. You wouldn't have known it. You couldn't distinguish that aircraft from any other.
Okay.
For what was your job during that time?
Well, I was a consultant, and I was on some boards of directors, and so the kinds of work I was doing, which was consulting work, and that was in a fairly broad amount of areas. Most of it linked to national security. So I would have been there partly for board meetings at a logistics management institute, of which I had been president before. I was doing some consulting work for a movie production company in California that was looking to, at that time, actually make the picture that ultimately was filmed on the Coast Guard Academy's training for doing work in the Coast Guard. So those were the types of activities. And I was still in fairly close contact with a number of people in the national security environment.
Okay.
Okay.
5. What did you witness?
Single.
Say,
Okay.
could you repeat that?
It says, what did you witness?
Well, what I witnessed
Right. Yeah, that's what.
no particular activity at the time, though it was not long after that. I got a different position on the rooftop, and I could see a lot of smoke coming from the Pentagon. So I knew by that time it had been hit.
Number 6, where was your family during that time?
Well, the family was in Connecticut, and so I was in Washington, and we had the condominium, and so it was also an office area on the 5th floor of Alexandria House there in Washington, or in Northern Virginia.
And for number 7, this is, did you always want to be in the military?
Well, that's an interesting question, and when you say always, as a young boy, I started out wanting to play baseball for the Detroit Tigers. I was fond of them, and in 1934, I was at the time in the 3rd and 4th grade, and it was probably pretty clear to me that professional baseball probably wouldn't be it, but I'd also had sort of a strange eye for anything in uniform. The bus driver who drove my mother and me from occasion when she was working at the courthouse in Winchester, Indiana, about 8 miles from our home, and the bus drivers would dress in very elaborate uniforms at the time, with the leather belts and the puttees, and I was very taken by those uniforms. I liked band members. I remember being taken to a band concert by the Kellogg, and this is the Kellogg Cereal Company, and they were giving a concert in Muncie, Indiana, in McCullough Park. Well, they had on beautiful green and white uniforms and so on. Well, I was just taken with uniforms. Had not much to do with the military, though I remember being attracted to military-type films. And most of those were built around World War I activities and so on. And I remember being sort of thrilled about, my goodness, wouldn't it be nice to be a machine gunner? But those were all very superficial kinds of activities, and the idea of the military had never crossed my mind. I had won a high school, I'd won a state scholarship to Ball State, at that time Ball State Teachers College, now Ball State University. And I thought I would probably pursue that and go on to be a basketball coach. And so my idea was to stay in the education field, where my mother had been a Latin teacher, an English teacher. My aunt was an elementary school teacher. My brother was about to graduate from Ball State, and he went on to gain his doctorate in music. And, well, education was very much the career in our family. And I had thought that they'd be it. Well, interestingly enough, right after baccalaureate in 1944, April of 1944, and we had baccalaureate and commencement early, because in that rural area, we went to school 8 to 8.5 months a year, but when school started, you went to school, and there were no excuses not to be there every day. But that occasioned a lot of time being put to labor in the farm area, in the rural areas, and so it was a good education and so on. But my aunt and uncle, who had attended the baccalaureate, approached me, this was late afternoon, and asked if I had ever considered thinking of going to West Point, even though I had this scholarship at Ball State. Well, no, it never crossed my mind, and in fact, I barely knew what West Point was. But they had ascertained that the state representative in the 10th district in the state of Indiana was home for whatever, it was probably near Easter time, and his name was Raymond Springer, and they said if we called him down in Connersville, Indiana, about 30 miles south of farmland where I live, and asked if we could come down and talk to him, would you be amenable to going and asking about perhaps an appointment to either the military academy or the naval academy? Well, you can't say no to the question, really, even out of courtesy. So we piled into my aunt and uncle's car, and we headed to Connersville that evening on a Sunday. It was a Sunday evening, and the discussion, which was fairly detailed and lasted perhaps about an hour, on the process of how you got into West Point. And Congressman Springer outlined that he did have the alternative or the opportunity as a congressman to appoint at least one person, and at that time that was every year he could appoint a person. And the procedure he used was to open the door for any youngster who wanted to try for that appointment. That they would take a full day's examination, very similar to what you would take now for a graduate record exam.
Right.
It covered mathematics,
Right.
quite a bit of mathematics, a lot of history, a lot of English and literature and so on. A full day, and he said he would take and give the primary choice, the number one choice, to whomever scored the highest. And the next highest would be the first alternate. The third highest would be the second alternate. And there were three alternates, one primary, and that examination was not going to happen in April. It was going to be handled in Muncie, Indiana, in the city library there. And then the results would be published probably in August or September. So that's fine. I almost forgot about the thing, and I didn't do any sort of special preparations. As a matter of fact, a neighbor boy and I went to Chicago, Illinois on our own money because the Democratic political party was having their convention there, and we thought that might be interesting to go just witness a part of it. And Chicago was an interesting city anyway. It smelled like cows because the big stockyards were still there. It had two baseball teams, and we went to a baseball game. Well, I think it was just the week after I came back from that trip to Chicago that I took the examination. And quite frankly, I thought I could handle some of it, but in the mathematics area, I distinctly remember there was a section on logarithms, and I had no earthly idea what a logarithm was, much less being able to answer any questions. Well, so I kind of put it aside. Well, lo and behold, now running the reel forward, I think it was the last week in August or the first week in September, and I was already at Ball State. I received notice that I had gained the primary appointment, that I had scored the highest, and they outlined, because there were a number of people that I would say there were maybe 12 to 15 people who had taken the examination that day in Muncie. Well, that was a great surprise to me. But now I have the choice either to stay with the Ball State career or to go to West Point. Well, I thought just out of, well, partly family loyalty, if my kinfolk had taken the trouble to go as far as they did, I couldn't say no to that. And quite frankly, West Point had a reputation that was quite different than the Ball State Teachers College. Though the size of the two schools was about the same, curiously enough. West Point had about 2,000 people and Ball State had about 1,500. Well, in any event, that's a long-winded way of my introduction to the military. I entered not being aware of what I was getting into or even remotely what it would mean.
8. What do you remember about the response of the American people to the attacks?
Well,
Oh wait, have it.
Or sorry, I skipped. It's no, I did that one already. Wait, you're recording this.
Okay, sorry.
It says, what do you remember about the response of the American people to the attacks?
well, I remember one thing was it would be a surprise because it would be the first time we've been attacked actually in our country on an occasion of any kind in a long time. And so the occasion was one. It seemed to me too that there, and the media coverage was an introduction to what we have now found to be the normal. We're more interested in trying to figure out who was at fault and why did somebody do something wrong than they were with what really is going on. And I think that was one of our first introductions to a medium that now we find common and so customary, but it was an introduction to, well, media coverage that was a lot more interested in where the president was, what he was doing, why was he doing that, and a media that we've now found to be more interested in that more than anything else.
All right. It says number 9. Do you consider 9/11 to be a pivotal event in your life, in your nation's history, world history?
Well,
Pivotal.
when you say a pivotal event,
Yeah.
that's an interesting term because it can mean so many things. Pivotal in the sense that it alarms us and calls to attention that we can be attacked and we can be hit. And given the kinds of weapons that exist after World War II, including all the weapons of mass destruction, whether it be the atomic or the nuclear, or whether it be chemical, or whether it be biological, that it's a whole new world. And this is the first indication that we can be attacked. Well, it also raises a lot of questions. Why weren't, and we're seeing that now with the medical area and the worldwide kind of episodes, that there are all sorts of things that are possible. And so this is kind of an alarm that you might start thinking about some of the other areas. Well, now it's very clear, because to say it's pivotal, you'd have thought we might have said we better be ready for all sorts of attacks, maybe the extreme ones, particularly those that might involve maybe hundreds of thousands of deaths. Well, it's clear that it wasn't that pivotal because we didn't do that. And that's a curious point now, and we need to go back and ask ourselves, at this point now, we've had another big event And how pivotal is this? And if this isn't pivotal, then the word pivotal doesn't mean what I would have hoped it might mean in getting the nation ready to be able to handle these kinds of situations, and in effect to deter and to obviate the possibilities of these kinds of things happening. So it was pivotal in the sense it was a dramatic event, particularly in hitting New York City, and the attention to it was probably because of that, and it's also more interesting than, or as interesting, that the attention has been so heavily on the New York City part and not on the attack in Washington, D.C. One would have thought that if they tried once and for a variety of reasons didn't carry out, I think, the target that they had probably in their game plan, that of either hitting the White House or the Capitol building. But I think there's a fair amount of evidence that the Pentagon would have obviously been their third choice, but also that it was a very hard one to hit because it was harder to get to, and the fact that it wasn't known at the time to the attackers that the Pentagon had just gone through a restructuring, and the side of the building in which that airplane finally hit obviously wasn't their first choice, because it was the strongest and hardest thing to dent that they could have possibly hit. If they'd hit on any other four sides, they would have done far, far more damage. So it has a lot of interesting aspects that probably still aren't and have been thought about by now. So you say pivotal. Do you think we think of those things? And how often do you see and hear national security commentary on what is next in terms of dramatic attacks and hits? You can be sure that the Pentagon, the military, is geared to handle those kinds of things. You, I think, have to give credit to the military for attacking the main parts of the Taliban and those parts of different ethnic, religious groups and so on that are going to take on the United States and attack us, that we've at least now almost done 2 decades worth of protection. So you can say so far, either through good planning, also a lot of military activity that goes unnoticed. And I would put a footnote by that. The Air Force, of which I was a member for 25 to 30 years, has been at war constantly since 1991.
Wow.
I mean, constantly. Well, you'd have to say that must have been somebody's plan or so. Well, it just so happens that just at the end of the war in Vietnam, we went from a draft situation to an all-volunteer force. And the all-volunteer force reduces the number of people who have military experience. And the number of people who have military experience is diminishing, and other people are just forgetting it. They're taking for granted that we'll be protected because we always have been. And we haven't had disasters like we have now in the medical area. But we've had far more deaths in the military during this 20 years than were killed in New York City. And so if you're worried about where is the danger and so on, the danger still lies with those who are wearing uniforms and are taking on jobs that they did out of patriotism, they did it out of loyalty, they did it out of conviction that somebody has to do it, and that there will be enough people of that ilk that we can have confidence that those people will sacrifice their life as they have consistently and not be crying about it or saying we need other kinds of assistance. You can see where we failed. The Department for Veterans Affairs has a reputation for not being adequately funded. So that shows how concerned we are about things. We're concerned about remembering those people who were first providers in New York City on September 11th in 2001. But we're forgetting the group that we should think about, some who would like to think about what are some of the other things that could happen. Let me just tell you as a footnote, I had the opportunity in 1955, not long after Hiroshima, had an opportunity to be included in a maneuver area out in the Arizona desert that involved a 20 kiloton atomic bomb. And we were positioned 3,000 yards from the tower of that thing. And when that weapon was exploded, we were in a sort of a slit trench. And the idea was to convince us that the atomic warfare is going to be very similar, just as an extension of conventional warfare, i.e. non-atomic. It's just a bigger bang and a slightly larger weapon. And I would tell you with great conviction that that experience convinced me exactly opposite what the intention was, that it's not just an extension of conventional tactics or tactical warfare. It's very different, and that was just atomic, not to mention nuclear warfare. The military is ready to handle those kind of things, but there are so many other opportunities to say we better be thinking about some of the threats here or there. And now we have North Korea, we have China, we have even smaller ones like Venezuela. We have them that are getting equipped and have the not only the ideas but the possibilities of using some of these other weapons. But we don't find that being discussed very much by the American public. So is it pivotal, or was that pivotal? No, I don't think anything. It'd be interesting to see if the virus routine that we're going through now has any pivotal effect. My guess is that too will pass, because that's the history of it. And we have very little patience. If you can't solve it right now, let's forget it, because we are not going to have the patience to stay with it for long.
All right, and the last one, it says, did 9/11 change your views of the U.S. and the world? Did 9/11 change your views of the U.S. and the world?
Well, yes, I think you'd have to say, if you're paying attention, sure, it's going to have some effect on it. But I don't think the question is another version of pivotal. Did it change it to the degree that you think, well, now we're going to get prepared and we'll really have a security structure that anticipates and works on these things? No, I think that's been overtaken far a long time ago by, one, the environment. Another would be having a full-time opportunity for schooling. Another would be a long list before you ever got down to security. That's taken for granted, and probably, it's not a very promising kind of thing, because our societal bent is to think somebody else will take care of it. We won't have to sacrifice anything, and we don't want to be bothered with worrying about things that are so off the chart in terms of probability.
Okay. And we're finished.
May I ask a question? 2 questions?
There you go.
You kind of touched upon this, Dad, but as a retired lieutenant general, and with those glasses on, how did you view the attacks? I guess. Is that...
Well, the initial view is, how in the world did we allow those people to take over those aircraft? And how in the world did they maneuver them? Because, for example, just getting acquainted with the cockpit, I don't think well, that's, I think just the aviation part of it and
right.
the ability to do that. Now, obviously, they had, in each case, somebody else took the airplane off the ground and got it airborne, because they were pretty heavily loaded, and the takeoffs are, you better do it right, or you're in big trouble. I'm sure they didn't intend to fly off the end of the runway and smash it there.
Right.
So I think just the aviation part of it was the most intriguing, and particularly the Pentagon mission ended up to be far and away the hardest.
Got it.
Dad, did you know anyone who died at the Pentagon that day?
No, I didn't.
Personally?
As it turned out, the aircraft hit on the side of the building that is mostly naval, and that was just a curiosity, because I'm sure they would have wanted to hit well, at least 2 elements away, where the Secretary of Defense and and the Air Forces on that side of the building was SecDef. So I'm sure they would have wanted to hit there. But they I'm sure didn't know what they were doing. They were just hitting that building.
Got it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me applaud you at the school for being interested in these kinds of issues. But may I suggest that these kinds of issues bring on others that I think are equally important, at least equally and maybe much more important, in the area of security, if that's what we want to focus on. And if the objective is that, then there are a lot more issues that need to be attended to, unless we want to keep on having epidemics to surprise us, all manner of things. And we've forgotten that in the weapons of mass destruction, the biological warfare has been dropped sort of off the chart. I would hope that it's back on the chart now.
Thank you.
Thank you.